Christmas is coming, and I will be alone this year. So please leave a Christmas greeting that will warm my heart in the comments. Okay, let's go. The Christmas visitor. I've always loved Christmas. The twinkling lights, the scent of pine, the quiet crackle of a fireplace. All of it felt magical. But last year, Christmas changed for me forever. It's something I can barely talk about without shivering, but I'll try. It started when my wife, Emily, and I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains for the holidays. We were both burned out from work and wanted to escape the noise of the city. The cabin was everything we'd hoped for. Secluded, cozy, and nestled in a snow-covered forest. It felt like stepping into a Christmas card. On Christmas Eve, we decorated a small tree we'd picked up in town, strung some lights around the windows, and settled down with hot cocoa. Outside, snow fell in heavy flakes, blanketing the world in silence. It was perfect, until it wasn't. Around 8 p.m, Emily looked out the window and frowned. "Did you build a snowman?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, did you?" "Of course not, but there's one right there." She pointed, and I joined her at the window. Sure enough, a snowman stood in the yard, about 20 feet from the cabin. It wasn't the cute kind with a carrot nose and coal buttons. This one was crude, lumpy and hunched, with 2 jagged branches sticking out for arms. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, like it was watching us. "Maybe one of the neighbors built it," I said, though I knew that didn't make sense. The nearest cabin was miles away. Emily laughed nervously. "We're overthinking it. Let's just enjoy the night." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I looked out the window again an hour later, the snowman was closer. By 11 p.m, the wind had picked up, howling against the cabin. Emily had gone to bed, but I stayed up reading by the fire. That's when I heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps in the snow. They were slow and deliberate, moving toward the cabin. I froze, my heart hammering. The curtains were drawn, but I didn't dare peek outside. The footsteps stopped just outside the window near the fireplace. I held my breath, waiting for something. A knock? A face pressed against the glass. But there was nothing, just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I crept to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain. The snowman was gone. I rushed to the bedroom to wake Emily. "There's someone outside," I whispered. She groggily sat up. "What are you talking about?" I told her about the footsteps and the missing snowman. She looked skeptical, but agreed to check it out with me. We grabbed flashlights and cautiously stepped onto the porch. The snow was deep, but the wind had cleared patches, revealing a trail of footprints leading away from the cabin. "They're barefoot," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. She was right. The prints were human, but oddly large, with long, bony toes. They led into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. "Let's go inside," I said quickly. Emily didn't argue. We locked the doors and windows, double-checking every latch. Emily suggested calling the police, but our phones had no signal this far up the mountain. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," I promised, though the thought of stepping outside again terrified me. Around midnight, the knocking began. It started softly, a gentle tap-tap-tap on the front door. Emily and I huddled together, too scared to move. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was pounding with their fists. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, low and gravelly, whispered through the door. "Let me in." Emily clung to me, her nails digging into my arm. "Don't open it," she begged. I didn't plan to, but then the voice changed. It became higher, familiar. "Please, it's so cold out here," it said, sounding exactly like Emily. I looked at her in disbelief. Her lips were trembling, but she shook her head. "It's not me," she whispered. The pounding resumed, shaking the door in its frame. The thing outside began to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that made my stomach turn. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a fire poker and a kitchen knife for protection. When dawn finally broke, we decided to leave immediately. But as we packed, a strange smell filled the cabin, rotten and metallic, like decaying meat. It was strongest near the attic door. "We should check," Emily said reluctantly. "No way," I replied. But she insisted, saying we couldn't leave without knowing what was up there. I climbed the ladder slowly, flashlight in one hand, fire poker in the other. The attic was freezing, my breath visible in the beam of the light. At first, I saw nothing but old boxes and cobwebs. Then my flashlight landed on it. The snowman's head was sitting in the middle of the attic floor, its crooked twig mouth twisted into a grin. Scattered around it were clumps of snow, though the roof above was intact. And in the corner, scratched into the wooden beams, were the words, "I'll be back next Christmas." We didn't stick around to see what else it had planned. We threw our things into the car and sped down the mountain, not stopping until we reached the safety of a crowded diner in the nearest town. When we told the locals what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "People around here know to stay away from that cabin," one old man finally said. "It's been abandoned for years. No one lasts more than a night or two." I still don't know what we encountered that Christmas Eve. But every December, when the snow starts to fall, I remember the knocking, the laughter, and the whisper, "Let me in." And I pray that whatever it was stays far, far away. The Silent Choir. Christmas in the mountains had always been a dream of mine. The untouched snow, the towering evergreens, the serenity. It sounded like the perfect way to escape the chaos of the city. This year, I finally convinced my wife, Megan, to rent a cabin for the holidays. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm. A stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and a view of a small, centuries-old chapel down the road. The locals in town had mentioned the chapel when we picked up our groceries. "It's been there since the 1800s, an elderly shopkeeper told us. "Abandoned now, but folks still say they hear singing some nights." She chuckled, but something about the way her smile didn't reach her eyes made me uneasy. Megan brushed it off. "You're always looking for something spooky," she teased as we loaded the car. I laughed, but a part of me couldn't shake the shopkeeper's tone. The first night was peaceful. Snow fell in thick flakes outside, and we cuddled by the fire with mugs of hot chocolate. The cabin creaked and groaned, but I chalked it up to the wind and the age of the place. Around midnight, as Megan drifted off to sleep, I noticed the faint sound of music. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was singing, soft, ethereal voices floating through the night. I got up and looked out the window. The snow-covered chapel stood silent in the moonlight. No lights, no movement. Yet the singing continued, faint but unmistakable. "Megan," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Do you hear that?" She groaned, half asleep. "It's just the wind, babe. Go to bed." But it wasn't the wind. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the singing. Megan dismissed it as my imagination, but when night fell, I sat by the window, listening. At first, it was quiet, But around midnight the voices returned. Closer this time. It was a haunting melody, harmonized in a way that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't joyful like a Christmas carol. It was mournful, almost like a dirge. I woke Megan again. This time she heard it too. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "I don't know," I said, staring out at the chapel. "But it's coming from there." We stayed up, listening, until the voices faded just before dawn. The next day, we decided to explore the chapel. Megan wasn't thrilled about the idea, but curiosity got the better of both of us. We trudged through the snow, the air sharp with cold, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was dilapidated, the pews rotting, and the altar covered in dust. Faded murals of saints adorned the walls, their faces peeling and warped. A chill lingered in the air, colder than outside. "What do you think they used it for?" Megan asked, her voice echoing in the empty space. "Mass, I guess. Funerals, maybe," I replied, though I felt like I was intruding. As we turned to leave, I noticed something etched into the wall near the door. A symbol I didn't recognize. It looked like a twisted version of a cross, surrounded by concentric circles. It wasn't comforting. That night, the singing returned, louder than ever. This time, when I looked out the window, I saw them. Figures in dark robes stood in a circle around the chapel. They were barely visible against the snow, but the glow of the moon outlined their forms. They swayed as they sang, their heads tilted toward the sky. "Megan!" I hissed, shaking her awake. She joined me at the window, her face pale. "What the hell?" I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Around 2 a.m., the singing stopped abruptly. The silence was almost worse. Megan and I sat frozen on the couch, every creak of the cabin making us jump. Then the knocking began. It was slow and deliberate, coming from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. "Don't answer it," Megan whispered, clutching my arm. "Of course not," I said, though my legs felt like jelly. The knocking moved, now coming from the windows. One by one, the glass panes rattled as if someone, or something, was testing them. We retreated to the bedroom, locking the door and pushing the dresser in front of it. But the knocking didn't stop. It seemed to surround us, echoing from every wall. Then we heard footsteps in the attic. "I thought this place didn't have an attic," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "It doesn't," I said, though I wasn't sure anymore. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and moving closer. Suddenly, a loud crash came from above us, followed by a dragging sound. Megan was crying now, and I felt utterly powerless. The dragging stopped, replaced by a faint, raspy whisper. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but then they grew louder. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" I screamed at it to leave us alone, but the whispering only turned to laughter, cold, hollow, and echoing. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the noises stopped. We didn't waste a second. Throwing our belongings into bags, we ran to the car and sped down the mountain, not even bothering to clear the snow from the windshield. When we reached the safety of town, I told the locals what had happened. They exchanged uneasy glances, but one old man finally spoke. "That chapel hasn't been used for 100 years, he said. "Not since the choir disappeared during a Christmas Eve service. They say they still sing, looking for new voices to join them." We left that town and never looked back. But every Christmas, I hear them in my dreams. The mournful melody, the knocking, and the whisper. Join us. The Haunting of Lussinatta. I had never heard of Lussi or Lussinatta before I arrived in Norway. I was an exchange student from Illinois, spending the winter with the Fjellheim family in a remote village surrounded by thick forests and icy fjords. The Fjellheims were kind. Eirik and Ragnhild treated me like their own, and their daughter Ingrid quickly became a friend. But as the nights grew longer and colder, I started noticing the tension in their home. It began in early December. Eirik and Ragnhild seemed unusually busy, rushing to complete tasks around the house, stocking firewood, and scrubbing every corner as if their lives depended on it. Ingrid explained it was tradition to prepare for Lussinatta, the longest night of the year, on December 13th. Lussi doesn't like laziness, Ingrid said with a half smile, though her tone betrayed a hint of unease. If you're not ready, she'll punish you. Who's Lussi? I asked. She hesitated, glancing at her parents before answering. A spirit, or a demon, depending on who you ask. She leads the Lusseferda, evil spirits who come out on Lussinatta. But don't worry, it's just an old story to scare kids. Her words didn't comfort me, especially after I noticed how carefully her parents avoided talking about it. When I asked Eirik, he just muttered, "It's best to respect traditions," and changed the subject. On December 12th, the Fjellheim's house felt different. Eirik nailed bundles of dried herbs over every window and door. Ragnhild lit candles in every room, murmuring prayers in Norwegian I didn't understand. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the house itself held its breath. Ingrid and I sat in her room, the only place that felt normal, scrolling through videos on her phone to pass the time. "Do you really believe in this stuff?" I asked her. She shrugged. "I don't know. My grandmother swore she saw Lussi when she was young. Said Lussi stood outside her window with glowing eyes, whispering her name. That's why we always cover the windows." That night, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and shaking the walls. Despite the candles, shadows stretched and danced ominously across the room. I tried to sleep, but woke with a start to a sharp, tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window above my bed. I froze. The tapping was deliberate, insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My breath caught when I noticed the frost on the glass shifting, forming what looked like claw marks. Summoning my courage, I pulled the blanket over my head and squeezed my eyes shut. The tapping stopped, but I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, Ragnhild seemed pale and distracted. When I told her about the tapping, she didn't dismiss it as a tree branch or the wind. Instead, she handed me a small sprig of herbs tied with a red ribbon. "Keep this with you tonight," she said. "It will protect you." That evening, the Fjellheims insisted we stay together in the living room. The fire roared in the hearth, and the air smelled of pine and candle wax. Eirik told stories to pass the time, but his eyes constantly darted to the windows, where frost patterns twisted into shapes that looked unnervingly like faces. Around midnight, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the room. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, I heard a creaking sound, floorboards groaning under heavy weight. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Eirik stood, his face grim. "Stay here." We all listened as his footsteps disappeared down the hall. Then, a deafening crash echoed through the house, followed by Eirik shouting something in Norwegian. Ingrid grabbed my hand. "Stay close!" When Eirik returned, his face was ashen. "The pantry door flew open," he said. "Everything inside. It's scattered everywhere." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Wait out the night," Ragnhild said firmly. "Lussi cannot enter if we stay vigilant." The hours dragged on, punctuated by strange noises. Knocks on the walls, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and once the sound of a woman laughing faintly in the distance. But the worst came just before dawn. I was sitting near the fire when a prickling sensation made me look toward the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the candlelight, but then I saw her. A pale, gaunt face pressed against the glass, her eyes glowing like embers. Her lips curled into a malicious grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "Lucy," Ingrid whispered, clutching my arm. Lucy's gaze seemed to pierce through me. Her bony fingers tapped the glass, leaving frost trails in their wake. The room filled with an unbearable tension, the air so thick it felt like I was drowning. Then, with a deafening crack, the glass shattered inward. Eirik shouted something I couldn't understand, and Ragnhild threw a handful of herbs toward the window. Lussi recoiled with an ear-piercing screech, her form dissolving into a swirl of shadow and frost that disappeared into the night. By morning, the house was eerily quiet. The shattered glass had somehow reassembled itself, but the frost patterns remained, twisting into grotesque shapes. Eirik and Ragnhild refused to talk about what happened, insisting only that we had survived because we respected the traditions. I left Norway a few weeks later, but the memory of Lussi stayed with me. Even now, I can't look at frost on a window without seeing her face. And every December 13th, I light a candle and whisper a prayer, just in case she's still watching. The Frost Hag. When my sister Chloe and I decided to rent a remote cabin in Montana for Christmas, we were looking for peace and quiet. Life had been hectic for both of us. Chloe was in the middle of a divorce, and I was recovering from burnout at work. A snowy escape in the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to reset. The cabin was beautiful, a picturesque retreat nestled deep in the woods, with a roaring fireplace and a view of the frozen lake. We spent our first day unpacking, decorating a small Christmas tree we'd brought, and sipping hot cocoa as snow fell softly outside. It was idyllic. Until night fell. The first sign of something wrong came while we were settling in for the evening. Chloe was reading on the couch while I worked on a puzzle at the dining table. The wind outside had picked up, howling like a living thing, rattling the windows. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the wind. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, low and guttural, like someone speaking a language I couldn't understand. "Chloe, do you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. She looked up, frowning. "Hear what?" The whispering stopped. "Nothing," I muttered, trying to shake the unease creeping over me. But as the night wore on, the whispers returned, growing louder and more insistent. Chloe heard them too, eventually, though she tried to laugh it off. "It's probably the wind through the trees," she said, though her forced smile told me she wasn't convinced. The next morning, we woke to find ourselves snowed in. Overnight, a blizzard had buried the cabin in nearly 3 feet of snow. Our car was completely inaccessible, and the nearest town was miles away. We spent the day trying to keep busy, but the isolation was beginning to wear on us. By afternoon, the whispers had returned, this time accompanied by soft thuds on the roof, like something, or someone, walking above us. Chloe and I were debating whether to try hiking to the main road when there was a knock at the door. We froze, staring at each other in disbelief. Who could possibly be out here in this weather? Against my better judgment, I opened the door. A woman stood on the porch, her face pale and gaunt, with ice clinging to her hair and clothes. She was wrapped in a tattered shawl, her thin hands clutching a bundle to her chest. "Please," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "I need help." Her accent was strange, almost old-fashioned, but her desperation was clear. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. She entered slowly, her movements stiff and deliberate. Chloe brought her a blanket and some tea, but the woman barely acknowledged us, her dark eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. "What happened to you?" I asked. "I lost my way," she said simply, her voice distant. We tried to get more out of her, but she only gave vague answers, her attention fixated on the fireplace. That night, as the blizzard raged on, the whispers returned, louder than ever. Chloe and I huddled in the living room, the fire our only source of light, as the sound of footsteps circled the cabin. The woman had disappeared. One moment she was sitting silently by the fire, and the next she was gone, leaving the front door wide open. Snow and wind howled through the gap, extinguishing the flames and plunging us into darkness. "Where is she?" Chloe whispered, clutching my arm. Before I could answer, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the cabin. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then we saw her. She stood in the doorway, no longer the frail woman we'd let in, but a monstrous figure cloaked in frost and shadow. Her face was twisted and skeletal, her eyes burning like cold blue flames. Long talon-like fingers stretched out from beneath her shawl, and her breath came in icy gusts that froze the air around her. "You shouldn't have let me in," she hissed, her voice like the crack of breaking ice. We bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door behind us. Chloe pushed a dresser in front of it while I searched desperately for something, anything, to defend us. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the sound of claws scraping against the walls. "She's inside," Chloe whispered, her face pale with terror. The window shattered, and an icy wind filled the room. The Frost Hag stepped through the opening, her skeletal form illuminated by the pale moonlight. I grabbed a fire poker, swinging it wildly as she advanced. The metal connected with her arm, but instead of recoiling, she laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that made my blood run cold. "You cannot harm me," she said, her voice reverberating in my skull. Desperate, I remembered something my grandmother had once said about spirits. "Fire and salt," she'd told me. "They fear fire and salt." "Chloe, the fireplace!" I shouted. She understood immediately, grabbing a handful of salt from the kitchen and tossing it at the hag. The creature shrieked, her icy form hissing and steaming where the salt touched her. I lit a piece of wood from the broken fireplace and thrust it toward her. She recoiled, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot drive me out," she snarled. But with every step forward, every toss of salt, she grew weaker, her form dissolving into mist. Finally, with one last ear-piercing scream, she vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind outside. The blizzard ended the next morning, and a group of snowmobilers found us as we were digging out. They didn't believe our story, of course, but we didn't care. We left the cabin that day, vowing never to return. Now, every Christmas, I can't help but shiver when the wind howls through the trees. Because sometimes, when it's especially cold and quiet, I swear I can hear her whispers. A cold Christmas warning. I never intended to spend Christmas alone that year. Work obligations kept me grounded, and my family, all the way across the country, had no choice but to celebrate without me. To make the best of it, I rented a cozy cabin in a remote mountain town, promising myself some peace and quiet. The locals, friendly but wary, had insisted I take the key to the old wood stove despite the modern heating. "The power goes out a lot this time of year," the innkeeper, Greta, warned me as she handed over the keys. The cabin was idyllic. It sat at the edge of a snow-covered forest, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. The living room was adorned with twinkling Christmas lights, a modest tree, and a wreath hung over the fireplace. It felt like stepping into a postcard. The first night passed uneventfully. I made hot cocoa, read a book, and listened to the wind whistle through the trees. But by the second night, I began noticing strange things. It started small. A faint tapping sound came from the window as I cooked dinner. Thinking it was a branch, I dismissed it. Later, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, the tapping returned, this time louder and deliberate. I glanced up. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind. But when I went to bed, I discovered something unsettling. Frost had formed on the inside of the bedroom window, despite the heating being on full blast. On it was a streak, as though someone had run a finger across the glass. The next morning, I ventured into town to pick up groceries. Greta was there, chatting with a group of elderly locals by the general store's fireplace. When I mentioned the strange frost, she fell silent, her face pale. "Did you see anything else?" she asked. I shook my head. "Just frost and some noises." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Greta leaned in closer, her voice a whisper. "If you hear the wind again tonight, ignore it. And for God's sake, don't open the door." Her words unsettled me, but I brushed them off as superstitious nonsense. That evening, the cabin felt different, colder, despite the heater roaring. The tapping came back, more insistent, and then, to my horror, the sound of faint whispers joined it. I froze, straining to hear. It sounded like a child's voice, muffled but urgent. Against my better judgment, I approached the window. Snow covered the ground outside, pristine and untouched. Yet I could clearly see footprints leading up to the porch. Heart pounding, I grabbed the fireplace poker and opened the door. The icy wind cut through me, and the snow swirled furiously, obscuring my view. The footsteps led into the woods, disappearing among the trees. A child's faint cry echoed in the distance. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it felt unnatural. I retreated inside, locking the door behind me. That night, the whispers grew louder, and the wind howled like a living thing. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps on the roof. I sat up, clutching the covers. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, as if someone or something was circling above. The faint jingle of bells accompanied them, but it was no merry sound. It was distorted, wrong. Then came the scratching at the chimney. My stomach dropped as soot rained down into the fireplace. I backed away, heart racing, as something, long and pale, began to emerge. A hand. It was impossibly thin, its fingers stretched unnaturally long. The nails were blackened and the skin hung loose, like parchment over bone. Slowly the rest of the figure followed, pulling itself into the room with inhuman grace. It was tall, impossibly so, with antlers that scraped the ceiling. Its face was concealed beneath a tattered hood, but I could feel its gaze, cold and malevolent, pierce through me. "Leave," it hissed, its voice like the wind through dead leaves. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table. The creature's head tilted unnaturally, its hood slipping just enough to reveal a glimpse of its face, hollow eyes, and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Panicking, I grabbed the fire poker and swung it wildly. It passed through the creature as though it was smoke. It let out a bone-chilling laugh, then lunged. I blacked out. When I came to, the cabin was eerily silent. The fireplace was cold and the Christmas lights had gone out. My phone showed 3:13 a.m. I scrambled to my feet, looking around. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed my things and fled. As I drove through the town, I stopped to tell Greta what had happened. She didn't seem surprised. "You ignored the warnings," she said grimly. "That wasn't just any spirit. That was the Frost Warden, an ancient guardian of the woods. It doesn't take kindly to intruders." I left the mountains that day, vowing never to return. But even now, on cold winter nights, I sometimes hear the wind whispering outside my window, carrying with it the faint jingle of bells. The Christmas Wraith. The year my brother Ryan and I decided to spend Christmas at our family's old mountain cabin was the year I learned that some traditions are better left forgotten. It was a last-minute decision. Our parents were spending the holidays in Florida, and neither of us felt like tagging along for a sunny beachside Christmas. Instead, we thought it'd be fun to rekindle childhood memories of snowy nights by the fire. The cabin had been in our family for generations, nestled deep in the woods and far from the nearest town. It hadn't been used in years, but we figured we could manage a few days with the basics: firewood, food, and a deck of cards. When we arrived, the place looked just as we remembered: rustic, cozy, and a little worse for wear. We spent the afternoon cleaning, unpacking, and joking about the eerie isolation of the forest. But by the time night fell, the mood shifted. We were sitting by the fire, the warm glow filling the cabin, when there was a knock at the door. It startled both of us. We hadn't seen another soul the entire drive up. Ryan went to answer it while I hovered near the fireplace, uneasy. When he opened the door, a man stood on the porch, shivering and covered in snow. He wore an old-fashioned coat, patched and tattered, and his face was pale as the frost outside. "Please," the man said, his voice barely audible. "I need help." Ryan, ever the Good Samaritan, let him in without hesitation. I wasn't so sure. Something about the man felt off. His eyes were too dark, his movements too stiff. "What happened?" Ryan asked, leading him to a chair by the fire. "My sleigh broke," the man said, his words slow and deliberate. "I've been walking for hours. The cold. It's unbearable." Ryan offered him a blanket and some tea, but the man barely touched them. He just sat there, staring at the fire. After a few minutes of awkward silence, he finally spoke again. "You should leave," he said, his voice hollow. "Tonight the Wraith walks." Ryan and I exchanged confused glances. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "The Christmas Wraith," he said, his dark eyes meeting mine. "It comes every year on this night, searching for the warmth it lost. It will find you." Before we could ask anything else, the man stood abruptly and walked to the door. Ryan tried to stop him, but the man insisted he had to leave. He stepped out into the snow, disappearing into the darkness. We stood in the doorway, calling after him, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. "That was weird," Ryan said, shutting the door. "We should go after him," I said, but Ryan shook his head. "He's a grown man. If he wanted help, he'd stay." I wasn't convinced, but the thought of trudging through the woods in the dark wasn't appealing. Later that night, as we sat playing cards, the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Then we heard it, a faint scratching at the window. Ryan froze, his hand of cards forgotten. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my stomach knotting. The scratching came again, louder this time. We both turned to look, but the window was dark, reflecting only the glow of the fire. "It's probably a branch," Ryan said, though his voice lacked confidence. A loud thud interrupted him, coming from the roof. We jumped to our feet, staring at the ceiling as heavy footsteps echoed above us. "An animal," Ryan suggested, but neither of us believed it. The footsteps moved toward the edge of the roof, then stopped. "Whatever it is, it's gone," I said, though my voice trembled. We tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, as the fire began to die, the cabin grew colder. The chill was unlike anything I'd ever felt, biting through my clothes and settling deep in my bones. That's when the smell hit us, an overwhelming stench of decay like rotting meat. "Do you smell that?" Ryan asked, his face pale. Before I could answer, the fire went out, plunging us into darkness. A sound came from the corner of the room, low and guttural, like a growl. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam illuminated nothing but empty space. Then we saw it. A figure stood by the window, its body barely visible, like a shadow made of smoke. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a twisted mask of agony, its hollow eyes burning with a faint, sickly light. "The Wraith," I whispered, the stranger's warning echoing in my mind. The figure moved closer, gliding across the floor without a sound. Its presence was suffocating, the air growing colder with each step it took. Ryan grabbed the fire poker, holding it out like a weapon. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The Wraith stopped, its head tilting as if amused. Then, with a sudden, bone-chilling scream, it lunged. We didn't think. We just ran. Bursting out of the cabin, we stumbled into the snow, the freezing air stinging our lungs. Behind us, the Wraith followed, its movements unnaturally fast, yet eerily graceful. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. The Wraith's screams echoed around us, growing louder and more distorted. Finally, we reached the car. Ryan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as I glanced back. The Wraith stood at the edge of the woods, its burning eyes fixed on us. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the mountain, leaving the cabin and the Wraith behind. We never went back. When we told our parents, they laughed it off, blaming the cold and our imaginations. But Ryan and I knew the truth. Every Christmas since, I've had the same nightmare. The Wraith standing outside my window, its hollow eyes burning as it whispers, "Come back." I don't know what it wanted that night, but I'm afraid it hasn't given up. The Blackwood Curse. For as long as I can remember, my family had been obsessed with Christmas traditions. This year was supposed to be special. My wife, Elise, and I decided to rent a historic house in the heart of the Blackwood Forest, a place her grandmother used to talk about. The house was old, creaky, and decorated with garlands and candles that looked like they'd been there for decades. It was supposed to be charming, but from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The first night was uneventful, except for the biting cold that seeped through the old windows. We huddled under layers of blankets. the only sound being the occasional groan of the house settling. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of someone humming. At first I thought it was Elise, but when I turned over she was fast asleep. The humming was soft, almost melodic, but the tune was unfamiliar. It came from the direction of the living room. I grabbed my phone for light and crept down the creaky staircase. The air grew colder the closer I got to the living room, and the humming grew louder. When I reached the bottom, the sound stopped. The room was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The old clock on the mantel struck midnight, its chime echoing ominously. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Elise and I decided to explore the house. It was massive, with 3 floors and countless rooms, some filled with antique furniture covered in dusty sheets. One door on the second floor was locked. "Probably just storage," Elise said, though she seemed uneasy. I didn't think much of it until later that day when I heard faint tapping coming from behind that same door. It was subtle, like someone gently knocking. "Elise, do you hear that?" I asked, pointing to the door. She listened for a moment and shook her head. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. The tapping continued sporadically throughout the day, always from the locked room. That evening, we decided to decorate the Christmas tree in the main hall. The house came with a box of antique ornaments, their delicate glass designs sparkling in the firelight. As we hung the last ornament, Elise froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I hadn't at first, but then it came again, a faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from somewhere above us. We both stared at the staircase. "Maybe it's the wind," I offered weakly, though I didn't believe it. Elise didn't respond. Her face had gone pale, her eyes locked on the tree. I followed her gaze. One of the ornaments, a small glass angel, had started to spin on its own. Slowly at first, then faster and faster until it flew off the branch, shattering against the floor. That night, Elise and I decided to sleep in the same room, both too uneasy to stay alone. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. For a moment, I thought it was Elise, but she was still sound asleep beside me. I sat up, scanning the room. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the moonlight. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner. At first, I thought it was my reflection in the old, full-length mirror. But as I stared, I realized the figure was moving independently, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. It took a step toward the glass, pressing its hands against the surface. Its face was pale and distorted, its eyes sunken and hollow. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The next morning, I told Elise about what I'd seen. She didn't laugh or dismiss me this time. "I feel it too," she admitted. "There's something in this house." We decided to leave, but when we tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine was dead, and the nearest town was miles away. That night, the tapping behind the locked door turned into pounding. Elise and I stayed in the living room, too scared to go upstairs. Around midnight, the door creaked open on its own. We stared in horror as a figure emerged, a woman in a tattered black dress, her face hidden by a veil. She glided down the hallway, her movements unnaturally smooth, her presence filling the air with an icy chill. "Get out," she whispered, her voice echoing in my skull. Elise and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. We grabbed our coats and ran out into the snow. The forest was eerily silent, the moon casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. We trudged through the snow, our breaths coming in panicked gasps. Behind us, the house loomed dark and foreboding, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Just as we reached the edge of the property, a scream tore through the night. It was the most inhuman sound I'd ever heard, a mix of rage and despair that made my blood run cold. The forest seemed to come alive, shadows shifting and closing in around us. We ran blindly, not stopping until we reached the main road. A passing trucker picked us up, and we didn't look back. We later learned the house had a dark history. A woman had lived there alone after her husband and child died in a fire. She was said to have gone mad with grief, locking herself in that upstairs room until she eventually died. We never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that locked room and the woman who came out of it. And I wonder if anyone else has been foolish enough to spend Christmas in the Blackwood Forest. The Whispering Pine Cabin. I'll never forget the Christmas we spent in Whispering Pine Cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a break from the chaos of our everyday lives. My wife, Rachel, and I had found the listing online, drawn by the promise of a cozy cabin deep in the forest, far from distractions. But Whispering Pine wasn't the peaceful retreat we expected. The cabin was picturesque, perched on the edge of a frozen lake and surrounded by towering evergreens. Snow blanketed everything, and the air smelled crisp and clean. Inside, a stone fireplace crackled warmly, and the owners had thoughtfully left a small Christmas tree decorated with rustic ornaments. It felt perfect, at least at first. That first night, Rachel and I curled up on the couch with mugs of hot cocoa. The silence of the forest was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind against the windows. But as the night deepened, I began to hear something else. It was faint at first, like a soft scratching sound. I assumed it was branches against the roof, but then it grew louder, more deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. "Do you hear that?" I asked Rachel. She paused, listening. "Probably just the wind," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. I wanted to believe her, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to move around the cabin, first above us, then along the walls. We went to bed unsettled, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I woke early and stepped outside to gather firewood. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. That's when I saw them, footprints. They were in the snow, leading from the edge of the woods to the front porch. The prints were large, larger than any human foot, and spaced far apart as if whatever made them had an enormous stride. A chill ran down my spine. "Rachel!" I called, my voice trembling. She came outside, still in her pajamas. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the footprints. She frowned. "Maybe a bear?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "Bears hibernate in the winter, and look at the shape. They're almost human." That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to circle the cabin, moving from one wall to the next. Rachel clung to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered. I nodded, but it was too late to drive out in the dark. The narrow road to the cabin was treacherous enough during the day, let alone at night. Around midnight, the knocking started. It wasn't on the walls this time, but on the windows. Slow, deliberate knocks, moving from one window to the next. We sat frozen on the couch, staring at the curtains. "Don't look," I whispered. But Rachel couldn't help herself. She pulled back the curtain just a fraction, just enough to peek outside. Her scream pierced the silence, and she stumbled backward, her face pale. "What is it?" I demanded. "Eyes," she stammered. There were eyes, glowing red. The knocking stopped, but the cabin didn't feel safe anymore. We locked the doors, closed all the curtains, and tried to wait out the night. Around 3 a.m., the Christmas tree in the corner suddenly lit up. The lights hadn't been on before, and we hadn't plugged them in. Rachel gasped, clutching my arm. "What's happening?" The ornaments began to rattle, the tree swaying as if caught in a windstorm. Then, one by one, the ornaments fell, shattering on the floor. The tree toppled over with a deafening crash, and the fireplace went out, plunging the room into darkness. At dawn, we decided to leave. I didn't care about the snow-covered roads or the risk of getting stuck. We had to get out of there. As we packed up the car, I glanced toward the woods and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, tall and shadowy, its outline barely visible against the snow. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze on me, heavy and suffocating. "Get in the car," I told Rachel, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't argue. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, but the car wouldn't budge. Something was holding it back. The tires spinning uselessly in the snow. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. As it approached, I could see its features more clearly. Hollow eyes, a mouth stretched into a cruel grin, and long claw-like fingers. Rachel screamed, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, finally breaking free. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. When we told the locals what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "You were in Whispering Pine?" one of them asked. We nodded. "That place is cursed," he said. "The original owner disappeared on Christmas Eve decades ago. They say his spirit haunts the woods, looking for revenge." We left town that same day, never looking back. But sometimes late at night, I hear scratching outside our bedroom window, and I wonder if the spirit of Whispering Pine followed us home. Thank you for listening. Bloody subscribe. And I wish you a scary Christmas. Good night.